Okay, a quick overview of topics. I have to motivate the topic a bit because it's not quite a typical computer science topic. I mentioned already that I'll talk about IP and how IP can be managed, how it's generated, how it can be protected, how it can be valued. The valuation is really the crucial item here. And then once all that happens, much of it gets offshored and outsourced. And I actually retired from Stanford, I think it's about 13 years ago now. And ever since, during most of this time, I've actually been consulting for the US Treasury on valuing intellectual property exports, which is a very odd job. Very few people do it. And I've been able to put it together in a book, which was very difficult because I can't give credit to what I learned for the IS. I can mention any companies that I've actually investigated, and that's quite a number, of them by now. But through that, there has a pattern has emerged, and that pattern is very quickly abstracted in this talk. I've looked at more companies, probably in that sense, than anybody else, because I'm doing this as a specialist. And if you work for the government, you're not even allowed to share information from one company to the other, and an IRS official in a large company is assigned to that company permanently for many years. So they typically don't get a broad assessment. So the fact that I have gotten a broad assessment is helpful. This was a bit alluded to already. When people talk in computer science about economics, they talk about the cost of writing software, cost to build products and capabilities. But once they're done, they walk away, typically. And then it's up to business people, economists, and lawyers and promoters to value the work. And of course, they all have their own agenda, and the results are often quite inconsistent. So the motivation for this talk here is a little bit to deal with the issues that people read in the newspaper about and don't understand typically. One headline often is that US multinational corporations now have about $2 trillion in tax havens. That's quite a lot of money. That's 15% of the public debt. So if it would, if that would come back, the taxes on that would pay off 15% of the US public debt. These are not small trivial amounts. You have to work with the Treasury for some time before you get comfortable with dealing with millions, billions, trillions, etc. Most people glaze over once the zeros become too much. So most of those companies that hold this money are actually technical innovators. Many right here in the Silicon Valley area, that we all love. And we may wonder or admire them when we find out that they pay 2% taxes. But since we don't know how it happens, we listen to their statement, and the CEO or CFO will state it's perfectly legal. So it must be all right. So I number these things because I'm showing where the funny things happen. They argue, we shouldn't bring it back, because if I bring that money back, 40% would go to taxes, and I'd be so much the poorer. Right? Another argument is that the IRS is wimpy, and it lets these big corporations off the hook, by hook or crook or bribery. And of course, then, when the politicians comes along, he says, these loopholes should be plugged. It turns out there are no loopholes. It's not a little Dutch boy that can stick a finger in the dike. Other people blame Ireland as a tax haven because it has a 12.5% tax rate, and that's why we're losing all that money. Obviously, if you transfer your income to a 12.5% tax haven, you still pay more than 2% tax. You know, another consistency that people don't realize. And the other thing, just give up on income tax and do it all as sales taxes. But the question there is, where are things being sold and how are they being sold? So on the whole, there's a lot of lack of understanding. To understand what's going on, you have to understand a little bit the overall economic model. The big green square that I have here indicates kind of public and private investments. Those are needed what gets started, you know. From Stanford, which depends also still on public investment, you know, plus all the tuition that people pay, you derive common knowledge. That's available to anybody. If you have a company, and my abstract company is called MNC, for multinational corporation, it holds intellectual capital, which is private to it. That intellectual capital has two components, namely the know-how of the workforce and then the actual intellectual property. They interact together. Having intellectual property without people that understand it doesn't do much good, right? Having people that are smart without intellectual property doesn't allow you to have a business. So that generates technology. It also generates value in trademarks. It all gets integrated, and you get high-value products. My daughter-in-law gave the name for the product that MNC generates. It's a Maniac. I have to be aware that there was a Maniac computer actually built many years ago. I forgot at the moment who built it. If you have high-value products, you have high sales margins. The kind of products that Silicon Valley makes, I see margins from 60 to 30% profits on the sale price. Similar profits, you know, can be made from drugs and other high-value items. And then from that, taxes should be paid, could be paid, and then the loop closes. If you don't have that intellectual property, then you just produce commodity products. They have routine earnings. If you have nothing original, you can charge between 5 or 7% over the price of what it costs you to make it. If you charge much more, somebody else will compete with you because there's no barrier to competition. So it is very valuable to have intellectual property. So in a business, 3 parts have value, contribute. Value in a business means it contributes to profit. There's tangible goods, the building, computers, capital. That's what Karl Marx worked about. That is what capital is. And quite frankly, many of the advice that today's economists that were taught many in the 1930s or 40s still advise, is to have capital goods. And those are visible, and those are shown on the book, and the accountants know what to do with it. But not as visible on the books is the know-how of management and employees. And then the intellectual property that is created there, the design, the software, the methods, and the trademarks that belong to the company. The latter two then make up the intellectual capital of the company. There's actually 2 words there for owned. If it's owned, it's intellectual property. If you look at its manifestation, it's called intangible property. Very similar terms, very overlapping, and it really means from what side you look. So intangibles are a product of knowledge. And they are characterized that the cost of the original is much more than the cost of making copies. That holds for books made by authors, software made by programmers, inventions by engineers, trademarks generated through advertising, know-how of managers, and also customer loyalty. It becomes ever less tangible. All of them interact with quality in the product. So the value in a business is a formula. And I'm quoting here somebody. It's one to sell Coke and another thing to sell the formula for Coke. But you have to make Coke in order to profit from having the formula. Just having the formula and not being able to make Coke doesn't do much. But it's a commodity bottler that makes the Coke for you. The commodity bottler gets his 6%, and you rake in the rest. So this is just an overview. So you can see them nested. They're intellectual resources, public and private. There's intellectual capital owned by a business. There are intellectual assets within that. Intellectual assets are those that can be transferred. That will be an important issue. How do you transfer the value of the company? And within that is, again, the intellectual property. So I mentioned already the two sources of profit, routine earnings and non-routine earnings. Very different ratios. If you're a Silicon Valley company, you want to be at the bottom, not at the top. People probably know about IP. IP can be protected from theft so that you really own it. You can have patents, copyright. And the most important value item in modern business is actually trade secret. You protect that through NDA. Only things that are very obvious would you bother doing by patenting. If Intel has a better process for increasing the yield on its chips, it would not publish that as a patent so AMD could use it. Because how could Intel inspect AMD factories whether they're using a similar process? So furthermore, it's a fast-moving world. It takes a long time to get patents out. Keeping trade secrets is risky. They can walk out of the door. But since things go fast, try to keep your people. And so in the cases that I deal with, typically 80% of the intellectual property is actually protected by trade secret once you do the valuation. This is, again, a warning because so many people measure intellectual output by number of patents being issued. Patents are issued by companies that are in a competitive situation and want to have collections of patents to trade. It's a very incomplete metric of how successful you are in generating intellectual property. Another valuable thing can be contractual rights that you have obtained. If you have the right to supply all the cell phones to Verizon, that's a very valuable item to have. Relations with customers, with suppliers. So we're dealing here always with protected value, and the people are kind of hard to protect. So there's actually a lot of effort made to protect your rights relative to the people. You offer stock options, bonuses, also pride in the work. And that's a very important value. When people got unhappy at Yahoo, a lot of people smart people walked out of the door because they no longer had pride in the company. Right? So they lost a lot of intellectual capital. So things were never measurable on the books. Just even counting employees is not a good metric there. Once you have intellectual property, you can assemble it into an IP box. That's actually a a term used in the licensing field. And you can sell that box, or you can license the box. If you sell it, you don't control it anymore. If you license it, you're still in control. You can also hack the box into amazing pieces, and sell pieces of it, tranches. For instance, you can decide that you give all the rights for what you're producing to a dealer in Japan, because you decide you cannot deal with the Japanese market. So now you have given everything that you have, but only a geographic tranche away. So, by doing that, you can convert even tangibles to intangible rights. If you have a big building, but you want to get some cash out, you can sell it to a real estate agent with an agreement. You lease it back. Nothing will change except maybe a brass plate at the bottom of the building, right? And maybe the door where the janitors work has a new name. Nothing changes. But you have sold the right to tangible property, and the right to both tangibles and intangibles is an intangible right that you can sell, split, market in very arbitrary ways. If you don't want to hire a fancy real estate person, but want to do the same trick and save on taxes, you can set up a real estate corporation in the Virgin Islands or the Bahamas or somewhere, right? It's your corporation. You sell your rights to that corporation. It could only be a mailbox, right? But that corporation now, when it makes income, pays taxes in the Cayman Island for its income. Since it's still in your group, the books that show up don't notice it. The only thing that you'll notice is that your tax rate has gone down because you're not paying as much taxes anymore. Now, and I use a building because then it's kind of easier to explain. So now we have an electronics company, let's say, and they make gadgets here in California. They're distributing them to EMEA is kind of the term always for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, because that tends to be one sales unit typically, the Far East, and well, in Latin America. And they sell there, and the income from their sales flows to you, and is profits for you. But frequently, that goes along now with some offshoring of work, right? You can move work to lower-cost countries. If you move work to lower-cost countries, you have to provide the IP there too. Hiring a smart engineer in India for 1/5 of the cost doesn't pay you anything if you don't provide him with the IP that he needs in order to work on your stuff and to make progress. So you also move rights to the IP, where the IP is physically doesn't mean much. But instead of moving it to India, you might as well move it to a tax haven, the rights. And then, to keep the books clean, when your engineers work in India, they have to license the rights to the software from your tax haven company. Because now, India has roughly the same tax rates as the United States, right? But you make sure that the license fees is such that India gets jobs, maybe even a commodity profit, if there's actually a factory there. But the remaining profits, those 50 minus those 60%, now flow to the tax haven. So people look at offshore as only being moving jobs. But one of the reasons it's attractive is that you can do further tricks here. So you have typically two kinds of foreign entities where you do offshoring. You can have an independent foreign contractor, and those advertise widely, and Tata and all kinds of people have companies that focus on that. If you have valuable intellectual property, you probably prefer to set up a controlled foreign corporation, a CFC. Then they're your employees. That still doesn't guarantee completely that no IP will be lost, but you're in much more control. It's very hard for a contractor who works 1 week on your stuff, the one next week maybe on stuff of a competitors, to keep their intellectual noses clean. Of course, once you do the CFC, you also establish a little tax haven where the rights to the IP are being kept. And now since we're moving this array around, we need to value things. First of all, you have to value things because once you move IP somewhere else, you're worried about the risk of loss. Having a 10% risk of loss is meaningless if you don't know what the value is of what you're apt to lose. Yeah. And so a lot of these risk type things are done very poorly. So before you went, what did MNC all do? MNC, you design some things, you provide the design to manufacturing operation, in Malaysia, maybe close to Singapore, because that's where there's a lot of shipping available and good communication. You have software being done in India and shipped to you. The goods in Malaysia can be shipped directly back to the US, to Europe, to Latin America, wherever you operate. The software that you have, will be loaded probably directly into your distributor, so it's always up to date. And the money from all those operations flows to you in the Silicon Valley. Next step. You now have established your tax haven somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. And so I call that company Conch. There's nice shells on the beach, etc. Right? And the only thing that has changed is now all the income flows to Conch. Right? So there's this new intermediary that you have. The orange Conch there. That's where the money goes to. Of course, Conch has to pay for actual shipments and things that are being built at commodity rates, but the rest stays there. Nothing much has changed. The only thing that has changed, and quite invisibly to all the smart engineers working at the company, is the initial transfer, 0, the rights transfer to the tax haven and where the profit is being collected. Steps 1 through 5 are unchanged. Now, there's a difference between tangibles and intangibles. If you have a tangible, you cannot cheat too much of the value, right? If you ship a locomotive, to an owner, and the locomotive is operated in this country or even in another country, you expect to get a price back that is reasonable for a locomotive. If your $1 million locomotive appears on the book as a sale for $70,000, somebody would scratch their heads. Even an IRS agent may notice that you've sold locomotives to the United States at $1 million, but you're selling locomotives to a tax haven company for $70,000, and they might catch you. However, when you deal with intellectual property, there's probably no experience that the poor tax accountant has, right? And if you commission a nice report from one of your accounting firms that convinces you that the value of the same income, let's say $1 million, but it's only worth $70,000, you probably get by. In very many cases, you get by because the poor tax accountant, even if he notices it's funny, he's busy, right? He may not worry about it. If he thinks it's funny, he may tell his manager. The manager says, oh, don't bother me. We have to close the case. We have a big workload. Maybe the manager's really concerned. And he goes up to his district manager. And if the district manager doesn't say, don't bother me, then it may go to the right division in Washington, and then it might be investigated. I have a contract with that division.
Well, furthermore, often IP doesn't have an equivalent or established market value to begin with.
Well,
if it's new IP and no one's ever done it before, you can't put it in the market.
No, you can. You have to. It's not easy. That's what I'm talking about.
But it's not auditable.
You can't compare.
That's not quite true. Okay. Sorry.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Let's listen.
Okay. So the principle of a value of something is very simple. The value of an asset, whether it's tangible or intangible, is the discounted income that it will bring into the future. That is true for a building. It is true for books that you've written. It is true for any intellectual property. The wisdom of the masses actually has some sense of that, right? Because they buy, if it's a public company, they buy shares. They buy shares on the expectation of deriving future income from that. They may be stupid and they may be lemmings, but get enough lemmings together, they're often more or less right. Right? So a first thing to look at if it's a public company and if the rights to the entire company are being sold, which is often true, then you first look at the market value. Now you choose your German company because I can't mention any American companies, right? They have, the shareholders based on the price of shares, that's already from 2005, was 31 something euros. You look at their books, all the assets that appear in the books that accountants know about, right? That was 6.38, I think, billion euros, I think actually. And what's left are the intangibles, the invisible stuff, right? No, that's 80%. That's not an atypical number for a company. In fact, it's somewhat low because SAP is old-fashioned and they own their own buildings, etc., and they own their own computers. And other companies will lease buildings and lease things, and they have even lower ratios of tangibles. Essentially all you need is yellow pad, right? And you can lease your desks. So such a ratio is kind of typical. Now the question is, how much of that is due to software? How much is due to hardware? Well, SAP doesn't make hardware, so it's easy. And how much is due to people? I use one company, which is a drug company, They fall into exactly the same pattern. And that was actually publicized somewhat incompletely by Business Week. But I could also look at the annual reports that are submitted to the SEC, so I could complement this a bit. What Business Week missed was this transaction 0, where the IP rights of Forest Labs, a drug company in Missouri, transferred its IP rights to Forest Labs Holdings in Bermuda. Now, with drug companies, that's the point you were making, it's very hard to value a drug. You know, a good time to value it is when the FDA hasn't approved it yet. Right? So you move it over, and the holdings company buys the asset rights. I don't know how much they paid for it. My typical example in cases that I see that the payments are 5% of the actual future income, maybe 7%. Now, what happens? You know, the drug comes out. This is from the Business Week diagram. Somebody in Phoenix pays 99% for, what do they make, Levator or something like that? You know, the druggist keeps some money, $76 goes to the headquarters. In New York, there's some operations and marketing cost. The pills are actually manufactured in Ireland, so they transmit the money to Europe. And in fact, it looks as if it's going to Ireland, but it actually sneaks under the ground to the Netherlands, because they don't want the Irish tax people to know what is involved. So there's another company called Forest Finance Amsterdam. I walked by their address. It's a bank building with many offices. Their name is not on the door. They probably have no employees there, right? What does Forest Finance Holdings do? It cost about $18, including the markup, to manufacture the drug. So they transfer $18 per pill, or per box of pills, to Ireland. The remainder, $44, goes to Bermuda. Ireland has to pay a license fee for the rights to make the drug, right? So $12 also goes to Bermuda. The Irish tax authorities only make money on a 5% markup because making the drug is a commodity process. Anybody can do it. They collect the 12.5% low income tax. So they get cheated as well. People in India and Ireland didn't mind being cheated because it created jobs. Okay? And that's still, a benefit for these countries. And so they're not going to investigate very deeply what's happening. The operation in Bermuda has to pay something to the people that actually work in St. Louis, Missouri. And it turns out that is $7 per pill. And there's a markup there. In the end, the United States now realizes this is an import, and it gets $1.09 from the $99 sale. How do things get misvalued? I told you the rule for valuing things. First of all, you ignore the human capital, because that's even less visible than intellectual property. You ignore ongoing research because that's income in the future, and it doesn't, and it's typically expensed on the books of companies. So that's just ongoing expenses. You set, whether you change the lag, the delay time that you've spent money between investment and getting the money back. So that gets a bit more complicated, and I won't go into that. You diminish the value of the IP rapidly. Oh, this drug will only live for, we have a market for, 5 years because we patented. We issued the patent 15 years ago. There's only 5 years to go on the patent. Of course, a different formulation of the same drug, etc., will come out, so the effective life will be longer. You can use a high discount rate. That's a typical financial thing. You can mischaracterize the IP license as being non-exclusive, available to anybody. But of course, who you actually sell it to is up to you. And you certainly wouldn't sell the license to anybody but your own subsidiary. A non-exclusive license has a much lower value, maybe 30% of an exclusive license, but you are the only one that can make profits from it. You allocate little income to the offshore sales. You don't adjust for some changes. You make funny interest rates. You see? If you were to license that to an independent company, they would have to pay for that, right? That means they would probably have to get a loan, right? And a loan, depending on the credibility of the company, will be anywhere between 12 and 18%. But since it's your own company, you can lend them the money at 1%. So you lend them actually your money at a discount rate in order to sell your IP cheaply to your own subsidiary. All these factors change evaluation, by anywhere from 10 to 50%. Once these all get multiplied by each other, you typically are left with 10 to 5%. What?
All the way down to 2% on your slide.
Yeah. That is the range I've seen. I would say actually 7% is typical. It depends how imaginative you are, how early you transfer the IP, So to assess the IP, the formal way is to do an income projection. Now, many companies, when they have a new product, before investing in its development, make income projections. They may not be true, but they are available. And that's an advantage of working for the Treasury. If there's a question, you have the right to request any document that was used in the company, during its development. It can be like pulling teeth, can take extremely long. They may deliver it in illegible formats that you can't scan. But you have a right to get, you don't have the right to ask them to generate new documents and new analysis. You have to do all the work yourself. So, but once you have that data, and you can also compare now whether these numbers are reasonable with other similar products. By the time you worried about taxes, you're probably a major company and the other similar companies that you compare things so you can show when things are, are very wrong. So that's what you do in order to do evaluation. It will never be precise, but you can make it credible. And especially if you find funny things in the way the original valuation was done, those you can correct. And often just doing the corrections gets you up to, from 7% to 50%. Another way is to do R&D rollover. You have invested in R&D for this, and you expect a payout. If the value is so low that your R&D has a negative payout, you're a pretty bad businessman. So the payout should be anywhere from 1.2 to factor 10 if you invest in R&D. You do all the discounting and all the nasty things. Well, obviously, and people that understand it are the venture capitalists. They would not invest in your company unless there's a good chance of an average payout of a factor 10. Because in a high-risk situation, they hope for a factor 100. Sometimes they lose. But on the average, they win. So there's some information available about R&D leverage. So that's another thing you can use. And of course, I mentioned always, if it's a public company, always look at the market capitalization. The people that you deal with may say, "Oh, our shareholders are stupid. I don't know why they're paying so much for our company." But then you look at at the annual report they send to their shareholders and say, "How wonderful they are! You should buy more of our stock." And of course, you model other existing businesses, in order to show what are typical ratios. And actually, business books are full of all kinds of ratios. Many of these ratios ignore intellectual property because that's not that easily found. But some ratios and some models exist where you can look at. So you can do something. Saying it can be done is a good inducement to get smart people to actually work on it, right? For instance, well, in software, you can use a model based on effort. Software has to be continuously maintained. What you're selling at the initial point is software that exists, but then will continue to be maintained.
But why does it have to be continually maintained?
Because the world changes. I agree. There's some. A sign function that was written in the 1960s doesn't need much maintenance anymore. Actually, I wrote a very mathematical program that did the combustion equations for solid fuel rockets. It was used for the Polaris and the shuttle. And as far as I know, it had minor changes because Fortran kept changing, but it didn't require much maintenance. Most other software, look at software like Word, right? It's grown immensely, and the size is a measure of effort.
Most of the reason that Word changes is because otherwise people wouldn't buy new versions.
Right? So they add new features. And some of these features were, very useful. Lawyers couldn't use Word until they stole a feature from WordPerfect, which allowed strikeouts and double strikeouts. Right? They added that. It enlarged their market. There's a lot of stupid things added, but if it adds a 5% segment of the population, so it keeps growing. At the same time, the price doesn't keep growing. Word today costs about the same, inflation adjusted certainly, as it did when it came out 20 years ago.
But you're not mentioning liability. Or are you going to say that later?
No, I'm not talking about liability. On the whole, I don't deal much with
Costs.
With cost. Okay. So that is one model you can use. You often have to take the time. This is actually a cost function. How long you had to invest to get something out. And then you look at the company. Is it a startup? A startup tends to grow slowly. That's the bottom line. And then do testing. And then in the end, just before it comes out, have a very high growth curve. Actually, a limit of a startup before it comes out is that the growth curve cannot be too large, otherwise people step on each other's feet. And you've probably seen examples of that. If you have a mature company, you have people around that have worked with each other, you still have a startup, you have an initial growth limit. So you can model how these investments go. Investments delay the time that transferred IP yields income. So that can make actually a very big difference to the thing. So you put them all together, you first have a simple model of how the value goes down, That's the bottom purple line. Then the black line, you move things over because of that lag things. But then, often, products don't get moved to foreign shores until they're somewhat mature. In fact, now you probably recently read in the New York Times about the Microsoft subsidiaries, Round Island and Flat Island, both nominally based in Ireland. So those were not established until about Word 3 or 4. At that point, Word didn't change that much anymore. So now your baseline is the lower red line adjusted to the transfer date. And that's now the 100%. So the rate of loss of IP over time changes. And another frequent case of saving on taxes is doing some misallocation. And I make here a simple example. You have a business jointly with an operation in Canada. The car was crashed, and it needs a $600 door. You can't find it. But you can buy for $5,000, a wreck in the United States, take the door out, bring it to Canada, or, legitimate export, you have your car in Canada again. Now you charge your US division the $5,000 cost, and you book a $600 profit from the income you got from Canada. Canada will pay taxes accordingly, the US will pay, but you get a nice tax deduction out of this. A bit simple example, but those things happen all over the place, especially again with intellectual property, which can be invisibly chipped back and forth. You buy a little subsidiary that helps you make your products. It becomes nearly invisible what's going on.
That previous example wasn't legal, right?
That depends on who you talk to. If you have a good accountant, he'll defend you. Things are marginal, right? This is not I wouldn't consider that appropriate. I don't make decisions over when things are legal. I'm not a lawyer. I only point things out. There's something funny going on that doesn't make business sense outside of taxes. Yeah. And there's a general rule, but it's very hard to say, that transactions that are obviously only for taxes are questionable.
Well, it works if you bribe the tax man, right?
We were doing everything legal. Actually, American tax people are pretty hard to bribe. On the other hand,
on the world scale.
What?
On the world scale.
On the world scale, yeah. Now I'm looking at what happens overall to the US. These are corporate worldwide data. They come from inconsistent sources, so don't get them down to the zeros, to the lowest percents, because they don't appear in any single document. You have a company that has worldwide earnings of, those are the total worldwide earnings, and I averaged about 5 years, but it took, 6 years, but it took 2 years out when there was a big problem with the economy. So the average is that, so I took out 2008, 2009. Worldwide earnings were $1.5 trillion per year. About 1.25 came from domestic sources, no problem. There were 1.8 of that was actually income from, earnings on foreign income from foreign sources. And then there were things that was really US income which pretended to be foreign. Like the Forest Lab example. Forest Labs, until recently, didn't sell any drugs outside of the United States. But all its income was declared to be foreign income. So what happens? The U.S. companies, pay the nice brown thing, taxes, and that's then the revenue that goes to the United States. In addition, about $5 billion goes from U.S. tax on, properly declared foreign income. Uncollected tax is substantial. Uncollected tax on U.S. earnings that pretend to be outside of the United States is also substantial. So what happens? After everything is done, for this company, $620 billion is available for corporate dividends and investments in the U.S. $690 billion is available outside of the United States. So that is the end effect of that. Now, very quickly, what to do about it? There's an observation is that the share of taxes paid by corporations has been decreasing. If there's a linear extrapolation, which is probably invalid because things never continue linearly, they sweep up. But if they were decreasing in linear, corporations would already be paying no tax whatsoever by 2050. They used to pay a much higher fraction of U.S. taxes, but they've become more efficient.
Infinitely efficient.
Right. So what are the effects over time? Of course, that capital builds up offshore. Rights to intellectual property builds up offshore. That allows more investment offshore. That allows more generation offshore. At what rates that will happen, I cannot predict. Who pays taxes? Well, employees, both employed by the government and businesses. Shareholders pay taxes, but shareholders also get dividends on which they pay taxes at a lower rate, and then there's independent workers hired by businesses or the government or whatever. So they all pay taxes. There's much yelling that there's double taxation of people that are shareholders because the corporation also pays taxes. I have the amounts for these actually in my book. So that was not the intent at all when I started writing and do my analysis. I have all kinds of nice recommendations on how to improve the system, make valuation more fair, make things more transparent, allow the RAS to be more efficient, etc. And in the end, I stared at it and none of them work. So I had a radical proposal. Do away with corporate taxation, but pay full rates on dividend and capital gains taxes. It turns out that's a back of the envelope estimate because it will be a process over time. That it looks that you'd be only losing about 5% of total, actually 0.5% of total tax revenues over time. Corporations will have to adjust. They will have to pay higher dividends to compensate the people that are now getting dividends so they receive the same money. You see, I'm not trying to screw the people that are receiving dividends, and especially not all the pension funds, because that's what I live on these days, right? But it would equalize multinational and domestic corporations. It would remove the motivation to use tax havens, and I'm assuming that some of the money would flow back. Not instantly, like I've heard some politicians claim. My model gives a 10-year line for the money moving. It would be disaster if all the money moved in because there's not enough things to invest in until the economy wants to buy things. But to a certain extent, we'll just advance what's happening piecemeal. So now I have the motivation to the initial questions. Is it all Is it all legal? It seems all legal after the initial misvaluation, which unfortunately occurs so much earlier that it can never be undone. The business have counted on a model that used that. It turns out the amount that 40% would go back is also not true, because even though that 40% for federal and state taxes is a statutory rate, there are enough exemptions that businesses actually pay on the order of 25% taxes. So the big announcement from Senator Camp about lowering the corporate tax rate to 25% has essentially zero effect once you look at it, especially if you remove some of the tax exemptions for corporation. But it sounds wonderful. The loopholes should be plugged. What I've described is not a loophole, it's a process. And you cannot undo a process that started many years ago. All large US multinationals now have, well, nearly all large US multinationals have substantial tax havens. And they couldn't compete without it. I mean, if you would tell Yahoo to stop its tax haven operations, then say, but that's unfair, Google has them, right? And if you then tell Google to stop its tax haven, well, it's unfair because, etc. And so the only people that don't have tax havens at the moment are the small corporations. And actually, the accounting firms are very aggressively marketing to smaller corporations these days because they have all the big corporations already in their pocket. And they have the intellectual capital to rapidly make you a tax-free corporation by setting up a subsidiary in the Bermuda Triangle. I already mentioned that Ireland having a 12% corporate tax rate should change it. First, you can't change it. It's a sovereign country. You cannot change the Cayman Islands. It's a sovereign country, as it proclaims frequently when it's being attacked. I have nice quotes from I forgot what the name is. It's not a president there. But Ireland has territorial taxation, which means Ireland does not collect taxes from companies outside of its physical boundaries. So that is why the subsidiaries in Bermuda are typically Round Island, Flat Island, are typically subsidiaries of an Irish corporation, not of a US corporation, because Ireland won't collect taxes. So the US corporation actually owns the Irish corporation, which owns the Bermuda corporation, because Ireland won't collect taxes from it. And then the sales taxes assumes that there are no transfer. And of course, when you buy things on the internet, God knows where it is and where it's booked. Okay? Geography is no longer a limit in this world. Okay. Boy, 5:16, I'm 1 minute over.
5:30.
What?
5:30.
Oh, 5:30. Okay, then I have time for questions. Good. I thought I had to talk to 5:16. So this is an old quote from an English magazine. Yeah. Any questions?
Well, you haven't mentioned debt in any of this, and to a considerable extent, where corporate profits are paid out not through dividends, but they pay for their capital as debt or as stock buybacks.
Yeah.
And those many corporate decisions are driven by the fact that debt is taxed at a much lower rate than dividends.
Actually, well, I address that by the way, I address it in my book. The capital gains issue itself is a very funny one because people say capital gains are double taxation, which is not true because it's paid for by tax-free money. The fact that corporations can accumulate debt to an extent that you can't, and consider the business expense is an advantage for them. And so one of the things that I address in my book actually specifically, if that would happen, banks would lose some of their power. In fact, banks are worried about that because, you know, they're the issuers of debt and they count on it and they say, but you need us because we're doing such wonderful work in order to protect our debt. We're doing such wonderful work in order to supervise the companies that they're not doing funny things. Okay?
Like selling toxic assets.
Well,
Like selling toxic assets.
So debt is an issue, and I address it somewhat. It's a complex issue. It interacts indeed with that, and I don't put it specifically in in my model. If you make a model with too many parameters, you know, then it becomes very unstable.
Do you think that all forms of paying for capital should be taxed equally?
We're not taking capital. In principle, yes, but you must be aware that I only deal with corporate taxes. So, actually, and I talk also more about that. The homeowner who buys a house and sells it later at a nominal profit should not be taxed or probably on the rate that is purely due to inflation. Right? But that's a very long-term holdings. So there are proposals, and I cite some of them in my book, to have capital gains indexed by inflation rate or something. That would also do away with the fact that now you get capital gains if you hold money only for, you know, for 1 year, right? Which is not, whereas capital gains somewhat to having lower capital gains and somewhat motivated, you know, to make long-term investments. But obviously, you know, 1 year money, does not build a company, does not build an economy, etc.
So I'm interested in, I see a very financially oriented view here.
Yeah.
But the value creation paradigm potentially transcends money entirely in its most effective forms. I mean, we can see the open source, money is still paying people's light bills here, but in an open source economy, one leverages the marginal cost of replication of IP and recognizes the economics are fundamentally different. So if we're interested in designing economies which perform well, is it valid to use conventional economics in the old world sense in order to build new world economies?
First, I would argue I'm not quite doing old world sense. I'm doing at least early 21st century sense. It is beyond me to change the global economy and to build a completely different system. This proposal that I'm making is not, it deals with corporate taxes. It is relatively simple. Very few laws have to be changed. There are millions of regulations that become moot if the corporate tax rate is 0. About 5,000 pages of tax regulations. Go out of the window because they're all multiplied by corporate taxes. And now,
Think of the poor corporate tax attorney.
what?
But think of the poor corporate tax attorney.
Yeah, no, in fact, I address that. Remember, GE has as many people working in the tax office as the IRS has to check all of the US large corporations. But they're actually very smart people, and that's what I state in the book. I'm confident they can get jobs.
But what changes intellectual property law, so the shape of our intellectual property commerce is profoundly different. These models are rather inapplicable to a new world information economy.
Right. But I don't know what the new, that goes beyond my dealings. You're right. I'm talking finance, I'm talking corporate taxation, and so I try. Even then, it's a 500-page book just to deal with that, right? but I cannot deal with the rest of the world. And then people sometimes that deal with the rest of the world don't go into sufficient depth.
Well, Wealth of Networks is a 400-page book, which is a nice counterbalance. I don't know if you've read it yet.
I've read it. Somebody else recommended it to me.
Yeah, definitely a good read.
Okay. No, I think other economic models are possible. But to move to them would be considerably hard. Even what I am proposing is pretty radical. But I think it could be achieved. Not in the current political scene, but.
Right.
So how much of a typical big corporate's, I don't know, management budget goes for all those lawyers that you said GE had?
Oh, it's a small fraction. I think GE has about 800 people working in its tax department. And of course, the tax department is headed by a former IRS commissioner, right? And they're well-paid people, but it's probably, I never measured, it's probably less than, maybe about 1% of GE's employees. And it's very profitable. Those people may make more profit, per work hour for GE than any of its other employees.
No, but if we pass your suggestion to Congress, and these guys are now out of a job, will that show up on
I doubt it. Since it's less than the engineers that are put out of jobs. Essentially by moving IP around. Now again, any change costs somebody, but these are smart people. Actually, that's actually one of the fun jobs. The lawyers of the companies that I interact with are intellectual giants. If a company can save $1 billion by hiring $1 million lawyer, right? Those are really smart people, and I admire them. And some of them know me when I go to San Francisco Airport and I see them. They wave at me. It's a relatively small clique because it's a small group that does a heavy intellectual work for all kinds of people. By the way, those organizations are nicely organized. If you look at the fine print, many of their organizations are organized as a Swiss club. It's a club of their businesses where the members are the US division, the Cayman Islands division, the Swiss division, the European division, the Netherlands division, the UK division. Why is it organized as a club?
So they can sell their yachts or places.
No.
I mean, this really is a game about chasing money.
You think about
value creation.
You think about real things.
I read books like Wealth of Networks, which talk about the future of information economies and how it's so radically different than a physical goods economy.
The reason they are organized as clubs is for liability. If you're a member of a club, you can share in its proceeds, you can control the membership, you can allocate resources among each other, but you're not liable. So if the club member company in the Netherlands tells you to do X and Y, and you do it in the US, the US company doesn't have liability. Oh no, that was done by a club member of mine in the Netherlands. Well, I'm sorry, even though we're members of the club, as a club member, I'm not responsible what my dear fellows are doing in the Netherlands.
This is very depressing.
Toxic assets are also an opportunity. I mean, why don't we just go back to selling toxic assets?
I mean, again, that is beyond. I'm not talking about doing anything criminally illegal, cheating anybody explicitly. I'm just trying to explain to you how the system works.
At 5:30, they stop recording, and then you can tell us, what you really read. You certainly won't say anything illegal on the air.
I won't say anything illegal anywhere. I've worked with clearances. I got my first clearance, top secret clearance, in 1957. And I know how to show, I know what I can say and what I can't say.
You're not supposed to reveal sources and methods. That's the fundamental thing.
And names.
Well, that's a source.
What drew you into this field? Most computer scientists I know would just as soon avoid economics and tax theory.
Two reasons. You know, before I became a professor, I was in corporate work, and I had moved up to the level that I was becoming a manager, and that was frustrating because it only deals with people issues all the time. And whereas research progress is much slower than what people think, progress in human behavior is zilch.
Oh, don't be too cynical.
Anyhow, so I had some background. The other, but it's purely an accident. A lady who was working for MITRE, who does consulting for the IRS, wanted to get out of it, and the reason I know is because we have interlocking patents on this, well, on some security technology, and she wanted to leave. She wanted to go to NSF. The NSF wanted me to go to NSF because I'd been funding the digital library in DARPA, and since that became quite successful, NSF wanted me to become a program manager. I didn't want to move to Washington. She wanted to move to Washington. We essentially recommended each other, and we lived happily ever after. And you're right, most computer scientists loathe talking about money. When I address that thing to some very smart people, they say, oh, I let the accountants worry about it.
That's why I gave you Perlis's epigram. Most all programmers think that way, not just list programmers.
So obviously economics and game theory are related, and being a bright gentleman who's probably contemplated the relationship between these two, can you abstract this back to the competitive nature of economics and how game theory might help us get somewhere?
Frankly, I haven't done that. That would be hypothesized. There are obviously games being played, but whether I've ever them formulated, it's game theory.